All right, here we go with Chapter 4, Section 4, Evolution. Evolution. Now we're going to talk specifically about biological evolution, if you will. Now, every year I get somebody who's like, I don't believe in evolution, etc. It's okay. The word evolution just means change over time. And that's what we're talking about. Looking at species and how they have changed over time. Now, this is pretty simple. Look up average height of human beings in the 1900s and the average height of humans in the 21st century, several inches taller than the average height of humans in the 20th century, especially if we're looking at 1900 to the year 2020, whatever. This is change over time. It's small, it's subtle, and that's how the change tends to happen. We normally like to look at kind of these big changes, but it's been over millions of years that a giraffe went from having a short neck to a long neck. It didn't happen overnight. So with evolution, we're just talking about change over time, and something that we can easily see and track. Now, the theory of evolution is a widely accepted scientific theory. I'll reference it a couple of times, but some 95% of all biologists accept the theory of evolution, have added to it, contributed to it, accept it in their studies. So it is a very widely accepted theory. Remember, a theory is something that's been well tested. It's not like, ooh, I have this idea. It's been very widely tested and supported by many scientists around the globe. All right, now we're going to look at evolution through the lens of natural selection. And this is the process by which species have evolved, changed over time from earlier species. Now, this book doesn't really go into it, but I think it's important to understand natural selection first through the idea of artificial selection. Charles Darwin is the one credited with kind of coming up with the idea and penning it in his book, Origin of the Species. But Darwin, when he went on the Beagle as the science advisor and went to the Galapagos Island, he went to the different islands and he saw turtles on this island and turtles on this island. They were pretty much the same turtle, except for on this island they had short legs and short necks, and on this island they had long legs and long necks. And you know, why did that happen? And he went, oh, you know what? I know what's going on, because I do that as a hobby. Charles Darwin raised pigeons as a hobby, and he would breed them for specific traits. He'd find a bird that had a pretty turquoise color on its neck, and he'd look till he found another dove that had a similar turquoise, and he would breed them. And of the birds that hatched, he kept the ones that had that color and released the others and bred them again until he had a species of dove that always had this turquoise neck. He did artificial selection. He, as a human, was selecting what he liked. We've done this with dogs. Ooh, I'd like a dog that was small with curls. So we took a breed, say a poodle, and we took the smallest two poodles we could find and bred them and got smaller and smaller until we have our teacup poodle, very small poodle. This is artificial selection. My daughter has a Doberman Pinscher. Doberman Pinscher was bred from 5 different dogs, and a specific this breed and this breed produced, and etc. Until we have the Doberman Pinscher. It was a bred, artificially selected organism. It didn't happen in nature, humans did it. Well, Charles Darwin ended up breeding his doves and knew that he could take 2 doves and eventually get one that looked like this, and he saw this turtle and that turtle, and light bulb, I know what's going on. It's not artificial selection, it's natural selection. Nature selected it, because over there all the food was high up in bushes, and the really short-legged turtles or short-necked turtle couldn't reach it, and they died out. Ones that happened to be born with a little bit longer neck were better able to survive, reach the higher up food, passed on their long neck traits, and evolution. The turtles changed over time. Now, most of our evidence of this natural selection or evolution comes from fossils, our fossil database. We find these preserved specimens of different animals, and this is physical evidence of past organisms. We find dinosaur bones. We first of all said, what is this? What could it be from? We look, there's nothing out there like it today. And we began to realize, hey, there are things that used to be on the planet that are no longer on the planet. It was a big deal back in the day. Now, these fossils get preserved in rocks or ice. Now, the rocks might be sedimentary, but over time harden, form into rocks. So our fossil record is just this entire body of fossil evidence. You know, it's everywhere. These museums have some, these museums have some. We put it on the internet now and you can look and research and look up different things. But it's the entire body of all the bones we've found so far. Now, it's uneven and it's incomplete. Obviously, it's pretty rare for a fossil to occur. Think about a squirrel dying in your backyard. Well, if you're like us, we have a dog, the dog's going to go back there and probably start chewing on it before we even realize it's there. In the wild, it happened. The vultures land, begin picking it apart. The hyenas come by, take the bones. There's nothing left. This is normally, or it rots down. And even if the bones are there, the bones tend to eventually, remember, they're living organisms. They tend to rot down again as well. You have to have the conditions just right. An animal dies and it gets covered over by a landslide or sand covers it up. Something has to cover it pretty quickly to keep predators or detrivores from getting to it. And the mud has to form. And then a lot of times what happens is the bone does dissolve and minerals eat down into that gap, and then we get a mold of what the animal looked like. It's pretty rare to get an actual artifact like this is the real bone. A lot of times it's actually mineral deposit left over forming a mold or a cast, I guess, of what it is. It's uneven and it's incomplete. We don't have every organism that's ever lived. We don't even have entire specimens of organisms, even like T-Rexes. We have a lot of this bone, that bone, but we usually don't find an entire organism. We find bits and pieces. We believe that the fossils found so far only represent about 1% of all the species that have ever lived. There's a lot that, for whatever reason, didn't wind up getting in the fossil record. So once again, it's uneven, it's incomplete, but it's all we have to go on for some of this past that we don't have a chance to see anymore. Now, I already mentioned Darwin, but Darwin and Wallace, independently, two scientists, contemporaries of each other, proposed this concept in the 1850s. So key for it is genetic variability. In order for a species to evolve, to go from being this into being a new species, there has to be some genetic variability. Like in humans, for instance. There's a lot of variability in humans. Hair color, height, bone size, size of our hands. Are we right-handed or left-handed? Can you absorb a lot of sun radiation without getting sunburned, or do you get easily sunburned like me? Genetic variation. There has to be genetic variation within a population. And what happens is we wind up getting random changes in the DNA. Just once again, randomly, I'm the tallest person in my family. Go figure. It's just how it happened, how it worked out. So some of these random traits are heritable. In other words, I can pass them on to my children. Now, I like to do races, like foot races, 10Ks, triathlons, marathons. I can't pass that on. I can't pass on the desire to go do a race, but I could pass on my athletic ability, if you will. And my children may choose to do some of these same things as well. So some things are heritable, some things are not. And then the gene pool represents all the genetic differences in a population. So we have to have genetic variability, And sometimes this actually just occurs through mutation. My eye color is kind of a blue-green. Once upon a time, we all had brown eyes. When the UV rays hit our eyes when we're born, it triggers a response in our body to produce melanin. Well, somebody was born without the ability to produce the melanin in their eyes, and they retained blue eyes. This was not a harmful trait. It was neutral, if you will. So it continued in society and is still here today. Sometimes we have mutations that are not harmful and they remain with the population, adding to our genetic variability. So, natural selection. These are the environmental conditions that favor increased survival and reproduction of certain traits. When we talk about natural selection, what we're really talking about is an organism's ability to reproduce. If an organism can't reproduce, it doesn't matter how amazing it is. It could be the fastest organism ever born. But if it doesn't reproduce, it can't pass the trait on, and the trait dies with the organism. So for natural selection, we're really talking about reproductive potential, the ability of that thing to reproduce and pass on this trait. Now, an adaptive trait is something that improves the ability of an individual organism to survive. A lot of times we talk about this survival of the fittest, and we think it means the strongest. It really doesn't. Any trait that allows that organism to survive. It could be a behavior trait. The lizards run, stop, run, stop. Seems like a ridiculous kind of thing, but if you're a hawk trying to catch it and it's running and it stops, you miss it. So it's an adaptive trait. That type of lizard survived. Ones that just kept running the whole way, it was easier for a bird to predict and scoops them up and they're gone. There are other reasons for why lizards run and start, some of it on just their aerobic capacity. But it doesn't have to be sheer strength or sheer speed. It could be a behavior, it could be intelligence, standing upright, could be height, allowing you to get food, could be size. If you're really small, you're able to hide in crevices easier than something that's big. So it's not always bigger is better, whatever allows you to survive. So we're talking about an adaptive trait. Once again, any of these things. Could be that a fish can swim faster, so it lives longer, reproduces more often. Could be an animal has a longer neck, therefore it can reach food, so it lives long enough to reach sexual maturity and is able to reproduce. And given any of the particular environmental conditions of that organism's day. Now, along with evolution comes this idea of resistance. We have insects that get resistant to pesticides. Well, in the picture we have up here, we're going to look at bacteria. Now, bacteria tend to reproduce very quickly. Certain types of bacteria can reproduce in as little as 20 minutes. Others may take as long as a day. But once again, one bacteria, 20 minutes later, 2 bacteria, 40 minutes later, 4 bacteria, an hour later, 8 bacteria. It doesn't take long for you to have millions and millions of bacteria. So any kind of small mutation along the way gets passed on. So bacteria are a great thing to study to look at resistance because they reproduce so quickly. Well, up here you take a look, we have a bacteria and we give an antibody or something to try and kill it. Well, the orange ones up here represent the ones that are resistant to an antibacterial drug, say hand sanitizer. So I'll put hand sanitizer on my hands, and it kills 99.9% of the bacteria on my hand, but 0.1% still there. That 0.1%, so it kills most of the bacteria. Some of the bacteria that aren't resistant are killed off, but some of the that are resistant survive. They then reproduce on my hand, and in time, mainly what I have on my hand are, hand sanitizer resistant bacteria. Now this can happen with anything. It happens with grasshoppers, happens with bacteria in hospitals, etc. We sometimes call them superbugs because they're hard to kill off because they've developed a resistance to penicillin, amoxicillin, the hand sanitizer, whatever it may be. So when things develop a resistance, we have to come up with a new drug or a new pesticide. And this is what we do a lot of times. Hospitals will tend to use a certain type for a while, and they'll switch it because things do develop this resistance. That resistance is evolution. One had the genetic variability trait that allowed it to survive. It passed on that trait to its offspring, lived long enough to reproduce more often, so we wind up getting more of the orange resistant bacteria than the blue non-resistant. Just an aspect of this genetic variability. Now with humans we have some very specific species adaptation. Our opposable thumb. I joke with my wife and our dog all the time. I said, no, the dog can't have pancakes because she doesn't have an opposable thumb. She has an opposable thumb, she can go make her own pancakes. This opposable thumb allows us a lot of dexterity that other organisms don't have. Our ability to walk upright, bipodal nature, gives us some height, allows us to see farther, get away, gave us some speed that we didn't have when we were really all fours. And we also have a complex brain. Over time, that brain has become more complex than many of our other animal kingdom brothers and sisters, if you will, and allows us to think our way out of problems than just having to fight or exist or hide our way out of them. So these are just some of the things that have advanced for us. Now the picture I'm putting up here is called the Phylogenetic Tree. Now it's a diagram and it's depicting the evolution of species from a common ancestor. Now this tree is looking at fungi, plant, and animal. So way down at the bottom of the base of the tree is what we believe existed first. And then through mutations or minor things, adaptation in the environment, things became more and more complex. So we start down at the bottom with some very simple type organisms, examples of fungi, examples of plant, or examples of animal. And then the tree moves up to the more complex. Because as a general rule in evolution, that's what we're looking, something moving from more simple to a more specific adaptation to its environment. So kind of the mushroom today, when the mushroom pops up out of the ground, that's just the reproductive part of the fungi. The rest of the fungi is all under the ground, and when it's time for it to reproduce, the mushroom pops out, the spores can leak out. This represents kind of the top of the food chain of fungi, as opposed to slime molds, which are very, very simple. The flowering plant is really the top of the food chain of the plant. The gymnosperms, naked seed producing pine trees, are not as complex or ferns as a flower or a flowering fruit producing organism. They're much more highly complex, so top of the evolutionary tree. With Oreo, we get down to things like worms and etc., and then up into starfish, and you get up into some of the higher insects or beetles or mammals, and we have a much higher level of evolution. So this phylogenetic tree is based off of fossil evidence and DNA evidence to try and group things into their particular groups of those, once again, those 6 kingdoms. In this case, we're looking at the plant, animal, fungi, not looking at the protist so much, as once again, it's kind of a throwaway. If it doesn't fit neatly into one of these categories, we tend to group it there. There are limits to adaptation through natural selection. First off, the adaptive genetic trait must already be in an organism prior to environmental changes. So the environment changes out there for whatever reason. Pangea, the whole the continents break apart. An island goes from being cold to hot, or it goes from being wet to dry. Whatever. The adaptation has to already be there. So if it's adapting to UV, you have to have some organisms that can handle more UV radiation than another. So when the ozone layer starts to go down, some die off, but some have it. If none of them had the ability to adapt to UV, they would all die out. They can't just spontaneously make it. The adaptive trait has to already be there. Very important. And then a population's reproductive capacity makes a big difference. Once again, bacteria. If a bacteria can reproduce every 20 minutes, well, its reproductive capacity is very high. Its ability to reproduce a lot, therefore the opportunity for these minor mutations or an adaptive trait to exhibit in its population is much higher. Humans, we don't tend to reproduce very often or very quickly. Oh yeah, I know, we would if we could. But realistically, most humans tend to produce 2 to 3 offspring, maybe 4, but in the time when we did 4 to 6 offspring, most of them didn't make it to adulthood. So once again, it's still, you've got to get to be 13, 14 before you are biologically capable of reproducing as a female. That's a long time compared to 20 minutes if you're a bacteria. Or a mouse. In 4 weeks, a mouse from birth is sexually mature. It's usually better to wait for about 6 to 8 weeks, but they can and will begin reproducing after only 4 weeks. Humans, minimum 13 years. And it's really not recommended more till you're more like 18 or so, till you're completely fully developed. So anyway, species that reproduce rapidly and in large numbers are better able to adapt to any kind of change in the environment. And the last thing we want to wrap up with here are kind of myths we get about evolution. I started off whenever I talk about evolution, I don't really believe in evolution. I hear what you're saying. You're not believing that life came from non-life in a sense, or that we all came from this. And that's okay, because that's not really what it's referring to. Remember, evolution means change over time. And most of us accept that pretty readily, that things are changing over time. So let's look at some of the things. I've mentioned a lot of these along the way. First off, survival of the fittest means survival of the strongest. No, it means survival of the fittest means best at reproduction. Anything that can live long enough and have more sex, whether it's turtle sex, frog sex, fish sex, whatever, they are survival of the fittest. They are able to live long enough and have the opportunity to pass on their genetic traits. Another myth is that evolution explains the origin of life. No, it doesn't explain the origin of life. It doesn't explain where life came from. It's only explaining what happened to life after it was already here, how it has changed over time. It's not trying to explain where life actually came from. That's a leap of faith no matter where you go. Also, people say that humans evolved from monkeys or apes. It's not saying that. It's saying we shared a common ancestor, that somewhere prior to monkeys and apes and humans, there was an ancestor that we all shared traits with and evolved from. Not that there was a monkey and then there was an ape and that humans came from it. It's that we shared some common ancestors. We branched off and evolved on our own through the adaptions, etc., of what we made. Not that we evolved from them, we evolved separately from a common ancestor. Also, there's this myth out there that evolution is part of nature's grand plan to produce the perfectly adapted species. There's no evidence in nature of any such grand plan. It is just life finding a way. It's not that nature's trying to, through some odd experiment, produce this perfect specimen. Not the case. It's not what evolution is. Once again, change over time. We're just trying to chronicle, figure out what has happened, why has it happened. And once again, sometimes people say, well, the evolution is not really important because it's really just a theory. Well, that's not really an understanding of what a theory is. Remember, scientific law, what will happen? Scientific theory, why or how did it happen? 95% of all biologists on the planet today, and many before, accept the theory of evolution. So does that mean you can find people that are biologists in the field that don't? Sure, 5% of them, a very strong minority. Most of us accept the theory of evolution, trying to explain how things have changed from the fossil record to today. Well, that kind of takes it up for our quick run through evolution. Hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time.